The Relatorium seminar for this month. I'm very happy to have Ted Chinburg, who has been a professor at University of Pennsylvania for many decades, and he's going to use his experiences to tell us about long-term effects of university teaching practices. I'll leave the floor to you, Ted.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate this opportunity. Irfan and I spoke often when he was at Penn about teaching, and I'm really glad that your group has created a place for people to talk about new ideas and different perspectives. So let me share my screen here about the slides that I made. I think I'm sharing the right screen yet, so let me try that again. Okay, there. So I hope you see a slide that says long-term effects of university teaching practices. Yeah. Okay, so let me start with a story from when I was last teaching calculus in the fall of 2020. I was teaching a third semester calculus course at Penn, which was mainly for engineers. And during the pandemic, we had a very rigid system for teaching calculus, so weekly quizzes, and instructors were tightly coordinated. And I pushed back against that system for a while, but at the end of the semester, a student took the final exam. I was pretty sure he actually took it, but unfortunately, we couldn't locate his exam. And I had to tell him, I'm sorry, I'm sure you took the exam, but we just couldn't find it. So you need to take the makeup exam in 3 weeks. And the student showed up, he took the makeup, and his score on the makeup was a 7 out of 100. Okay. And then, of course, we found the first exam. And his score on the first exam was 75. So he went from 75 to 7 in 3 weeks. Now, that I found a bit shocking. I was happy for the student. Of course, we used the first test, but that got me asking a question. I mean, this is sort of a question for research here. You have to keep in mind, this is just one anecdote. Generalizing from anecdotes is always dangerous, but at least it suggests a question. What is the half-life of the skills that students are learning from various teaching methodologies? And are there methodologies that lead to a longer half-life? And then related to that, I think, is what are the long-term impacts of these methodologies on the students' motivation, how they like the subject, and whether they're inclined to remember it later. So this brings me to my second story, which goes back to my very first year of teaching at the University of Washington, 45 years ago or so. And the title of this story is, "Why Don't You Just Tell Me What's Going On?" So my first semester, I was kind of in the middle of the semester. I was walking back from class, and a student came up to me, and he told me he was an efficiency engineer, and that he had some suggestions about how I could improve my teaching. And I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. I mean, this guy obviously has some courage. So I asked him, okay, what do you suggest? And the thing he said was, why don't you just tell me what's going on? And at first I kind of blocked that. I tried to talk about, really, is this the way you'd explain Hamlet? But then I realized, actually, the more I thought about it, the more I thought his point was exactly correct. Just think of other situations in which you have some relationship with someone, and one person says to the other person, why don't you just tell me what's going on? Okay? And that's actually a very intimate question, if you put it that way. It's not just about facts, because when somebody asks that, why don't you just tell me what's going on? They're asking for the other person's emotional assessment of truth and what matters. Okay, and the student was really asking for that sort of engagement from us in a calculus course, which I thought was kind of brilliant on the student's part. I just mentioned here at the bottom a relevant fact. I remember this conversation 45 years later. There's no 75 to 7 effect, right? That conversation had impact. Now I didn't write this out on the slide, but I want to propose a thought experiment. Okay. Suppose that you have some kind of relationship with someone, could be professional, whatever. And finally, you turn and ask them, why don't you just tell me what's going on? Okay. And then the other person says, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to show you a video of another person, another guy, and he's going to tell you what he thinks is going on. And why don't you go watch that video? And then after you watch that video, come back. I'll say a few things about what the other guy thinks was going on. And then I'm going to have you talk to your fellow students who also don't know what's going on and try to do some problems. And after you do the problems, then I'm going to give you a quiz. Now, if that sort of thing had been the response to my asking someone, why don't you just tell me what's going on? My response would probably be, this isn't really the kind of relationship I was looking for. I mean, I think I'm probably going to try to put this relationship in the rearview mirror as fast as I can. And I think that has something to do with the 75 to 7 effect, right? We need to tell students what we personally think is going on. Relying on other people in videos to tell them is not going to be as successful, in my opinion. Now, let me say this. This leads to my other theme here. How do different teaching methods affect long-term outcomes and motivation? And I want to talk about the active learning flipped classroom method at Penn, which is used for the first 2 semesters of calculus for engineers. So here are the ingredients from the website for these courses. Before class, the students watch videos about the material. They take 2 prep quizzes, retake the previous week's quizzes, go to lecture twice, go to recitation once, and they take a quiz in recitation. Okay, lots of quizzes. And a substantial portion of the class and recitation time is spent in small groups, working on problems and discussion sections. And this is what active learning is about. Students working in small groups with other students, and the faculty sort of moving around from one group to another, giving them some hints, but often the students flounder a bit. And in fact, when you look at the literature on this, the webpage cites some literature about active learning, and it says this: research has consistently shown that this course format leads to better learning in students, but the students feel like they are learning less, often because they end up talking with other students who don't really know what's going on, and they're trying to solve problems in that situation. So here's an example of the research that's cited to support this. It's measuring actual learning versus feeling of learning in response to being actively engaged in the classroom, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy in 2019. And what they did in this was they had 2 groups. One group was a group of instructors who gave more instruction, and another group used the active learning model, where people watch videos and then mainly work with other students to try to solve problems. And they compared the student performance and the students' perception of how they were performing with those 2 different systems. And the students liked the version that had more instruction, but on certain skill tests, they did better using the active learning model. Now, the question was, in this study, how did they evaluate that difference? They state in this paper, as I said, the students thought they had learned less with active learning, but they did better on skill tests. And they wrote that active learning in this article could have a, quote, detrimental effect on students' motivation, engagement, an ability to self-regulate their own learning. But, people will cite this study as the reason that we have active learning and flipped classrooms at Penn. The advice in the study was instructors should explain to students that the system will nonetheless lead to having better skills in the end, even if they don't like it. Now, my question in response to this always has been, what if we did medical trials like this, right? You do a medical trial and then there's some side effects. I think we ought to consider those side effects rather carefully, rather than simply telling students to ignore it, right? I mean, side effects are real. And in this case, having a system that's detrimental to students' motivation, engagement, and ability to regulate their learning, well, that's a pretty big side effect, right? I mean, so that's something we need to look into. So I'm going to propose a research problem here. I'll slow down a little bit. What are the long-term effects of teaching methods that have a detrimental effect on students' motivation and engagement? What happens to what they've learned a month later? How about next semester or a year later? And does this have some impact on the 75-7 effect? I've read a study about sports, for example, and there are studies about what the effect of students getting athletic scholarships to play a particular sport is on their eventual long-term interest in that sport. Turns out that in the study I was reading that students who do kind of intramural sports are more likely to continue playing that sport later in their lives, whereas students who are under a lot of pressure to maintain scholarships by playing a particular sport, they often do not choose to continue after their playing days are over. And I have some concerns about the long-term effects of these systems that focus on optimizing performance on skill tests rather than the student's relationship to the subject. And in particular, another research problem would be to see whether systems that are based on telling students what is going on via more engaging instruction might promote longer term learning and a positive engagement in the subject. And can you really get videos to tell students what's going on as well as direct engagement? This has been a raging debate at Penn ever since the pandemic. And the last thing I want to mention is this emphasis on constant testing. Does that end up replacing intrinsic motivation with extrinsic motivation? Right? When people study the theory of motivation, they usually talk about 4 different kinds of motivation. There's intrinsic motivation, where you enjoy doing something for itself, for its own sake. Then there's identified value motivation. Identified value motivation is when you see what you're learning or what you're trying to learn as having intrinsic value. And because of that, you're willing to keep working on it, even when it's boring, even when it's not fun to work on those details. But you see the value in doing it. Then there's extrinsic motivation, where you get the rewards for learning what you're doing in the form of high test scores or big grades or future opportunities, maybe. And then there's introjective motivation, where you do things because you think you should. Someone's telling you should go to medical school or something. And I think we really need to focus on intrinsic motivation and identified value motivation. And the more often you provide sources of extrinsic motivation in the form of quiz scores, exams, so on, that actually can be detrimental to intrinsic motivation. I mean, that's what the research on motivation tends to show. Well, okay. So I know that I've been a little past here, but I do want to say a few words of advice about the politics of math education from personal experience. I think it's very important to maintain some norms in departments when people are debating math education. There are different points of view, active learning, flipped classrooms, instruction-based teaching having to do with telling people what's going on. People are not going to see those things the same way, and that can be a source of a healthy ecosystem. It's very important, I think, to maintain a healthy ecosystem of a variety of perspectives so that you learn things from other perspectives, but no one of them becomes predominant and suppresses others necessarily without good reason. So leaders should create a safe space for disagreement and for stating inconvenient facts. There are inconvenient facts for any teaching ideology, and saying them is not the same as sanctioning personal attacks. That's an important thing that leaders need to clarify. A second point I have to make about math education is that the faculty who write texts themselves should really recuse themselves from involvement in deciding which texts to use. That is what peer review is all about, right? I mean, we don't referee our own papers, and we shouldn't mandate our own texts. My motto has always been persuade and cajole, don't command and control. So if you can persuade your peers that your book is the best or at least as good as anything else out there, more power to you, and I'd be happy to use that book. But getting in a position to mandate your texts is very different, actually. And one particular thing to watch out for is this. In a university setting, tenured faculty teaching calculus function as a kind of independent civil service. They can provide independent opinions about the systems that's being used. And again, people have to develop an ability to talk about difference. But just as we need an independent civil service in the US government of people who've been around a while and have seen a lot and can say when things are getting a little bit extreme, we need that in university math departments. Non-tenured faculty are not in the same position to point out potential reservations with the systems that are being used. Systems in which the only tenured faculty are teaching calculus are the ones who wrote the mandated texts. That becomes very unstable because with a change of leadership, everything can shift some way, and it shouldn't really be based on politics. It should be based on peer review and conversation. So this is a few things that I've learned over the last 5 years. And with that, I think I'll probably just turn the floor over to conversation. Thank you again for inviting me to come and speak.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. Yeah, I took lots of notes, so I have lots of maybe further discussion points, but maybe lots of other people also have similar thoughts. I wanted to start by asking you about what you think the universities want out of math education, in the sense that they definitely want students to demonstrate that the students have good skills in whatever test the students take. But clearly the way the calculus instruction is going in a lot of places, as you explained, they are over-relying it too much on it too much, to the point that students often just master some skill and then forget about it 6 months later. We are definitely not telling students what is going on in the sense of what is going on mathematically. We don't we don't focus on that. We focus on the skills, but from the students' perspective, perhaps the students are starting to look at math as just something they need for a prerequisite in their engineering classes. That's what I hear a lot as arguments in favor of such systems where the skill tests are prioritized. So the people who are in favor of such arguments would just say that students get what they want because students don't care about the math anyway. They just need it for engineering, and they get the skills that they need for engineering. And maybe if they stop using those skills, they forget it. Um, so what are the math departments generally thinking about what is their role? As you said, university professors have a civil service. In a sense, they have a civil service of educating the nation or whatever country they are in. But I guess there's disagreements between the professors and the administration. So
Well,
what's the purpose of math education according to universities?
the first thing I would recommend is that if you've ever looked at this YouTube video by Ken Robinson, look at the YouTube video by Ken Robinson. It's, for a while, it was the most popular video on YouTube uh, about education. He talks about the difference between learning and skill training. And the question is, how do you quantify that? I think learning, in particular, I'm very concerned with creating a connection between the subject itself and the student and creativity. Skill training and being creative with what you learn and the skills you are acquiring, those are somewhat two different things. I mean, you have to know skills to be creative, but I think we need to think about how to encourage students to be creative with the subject that they're acquiring, whether it's pure engineering, whether it's math. And for example, I really enjoyed the late Relatorium seminar on creativity. And I think we need to incorporate more of those ideas into how we structure our courses so that we get students to ask questions themselves that they might want to ask, using what they're learning, using the skills they're learning to ask questions that might intrigue them, and getting them to realize they need some space in order for intuition and the subconscious to work, and then hopefully have an inspiration to work on this, followed by verification. I want the students to be prepared to be creative in whatever field they end up in. And in some sense, you can pound the creativity out of students if all you say this is about is passing these skill tests. Right? You need to engage their imagination. I think Einstein said imagination is more important than knowledge. I think there's some truth to that. You can take it too far, and often advocates for skill training present exaggerated scenarios in which people don't know any skills at all, and so on. But I don't think that's really what would happen if people tried to tell people more about what's going on and motivate them to be creative with the subject. Now, how do we do this? I think we need to try to encourage the students' imagination. One of my concerns is AI, right? I mean, AI is ultimately going to do these skills much better than any human. At the moment, humans still have an advantage in basic creativity and thinking of new perspectives. And we need to recognize that's a valuable human trait. And for many students, I think maybe we should think about this more as an intramural sport that we hope they continue into the future rather than trying to turn them into professional athletes. Right. That's another question I have. The professional athletes, they're going to pursue their own path. But many students, if we turn them off from thinking about the world from a mathematical perspective, we've done a disservice to them, right? If I could get students to look at everyday phenomena and ask themselves, well, how's this related to math? I mean, is there any math in this question? That would be a real victory. But I don't see us doing that in our classes.
Yeah, we are focused too much on what they call tangible results, as opposed to focusing on what math instruction should be about, which is just understanding things and creating creating a sort of hunger in students to understand more. Once they start understanding some things, it should be intrinsically motivating, as you said. Um, there
I mean,
was a comment. Yeah.
I'll tell you about another course I made at Penn, right, which I think Irfan knows. Right? I was reading this very famous book by Harry Frankfurt called On Bullshit, which is trying to explain why is there so much bullshit? That's the basic question. He defines the difference between lying and bullshit, which is, you're lying if you know the truth and you want somebody to go away thinking something you know is false. And when you're bullshitting, you don't really know the truth, you don't care, you just want some support. And I decided this was perfect for game theory. I made a game theory course that I wanted to call bullshit theory. The administration wouldn't let me do that. So it's now called math in the media. But we use game theory to try to explain why there's so much bullshit. So if students would see calculus this way, maybe it can explain something I read in the news today. Right? That would be a huge victory. Think of it as connected to reality.
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, we are actually doing a disservice to our own history by not explaining how calculus or things in math generally have been fundamental in just our development so far. And with the advent of AI, if we are not very careful about that, we run the risk of young students just not knowing how things work and relying on things like technology so much that if the technology breaks, then they don't know what to do. There is a comment I want to highlight in the chat. It says by Yanis, it says creativity is methodological imagination. Um,
that's nice.
yeah.
That's great.
Does
Um,
anyone else have any
I
questions
wanted
or
to add
thoughts?
something. I know that Matt will have a lot to say, but I wanted to interject. First of all, thank you, Ted. This was fantastic, short and sweet, and very rich with ideas. It resonated, many things resonated with me a lot. Years ago, as my colleagues know, I've transitioned to primarily teaching from a career in research, although I continue to try to do some research on the side. But something I wanted to share with you, a particular experience that was that spoke to something you just mentioned, was in teaching to high school students. I've had the opportunity. Now, this I'm remembering. I'm telling something that happened maybe 10 years ago, but it's happened before and after. But the specific event was an occasion where I asked my students why they thought that we teach them math every year of their student lives. For 12 years in a row, all of them have to have math. Why? I said, do you think we do that? And that was a very productive, good half hour, 45 minutes of conversation, going in all sorts of directions. And this is at a elite private school, right? So these are quite well prepared students. They knew why they were there. Were paying a lot of money to be there. And we heard things about technology, about preparing them for the future, whatever, all that stuff. And they were easily debunked, both by me and by one another, as substantive, because, obviously no one is going to ask a high school student to build a bridge or a rocket or whatever, anything like that, where you might think math might be useful. And ultimately, I was very pleased. This is why I'm sharing. I was very pleased that the group arrived at what I was hoping. Well, I hadn't thought it explicitly in these terms, but something that I'm proud of, which was an appreciation that the reason we teach math is essentially the same as the reason we teach English, not because they don't know how to speak English, but to expose them to different ways of thinking, different ways of being in the world, things they wouldn't have experienced otherwise, and to just add to the plurality of perspectives. And, and that I think, obviously, Irfan asked the more specific, much more charged question of what the universities think math education is about. It's very different, but it ought to be somewhat related. Why is it that we as teachers teach? Why is it that the students come to us, and why they think, what intent they perceive and attribute to us or to the system. So it's a whole nexus, there are lots of feedback loops. And I'll say one last thing, sometimes as teachers at university or high school or at any level, we ask ourselves, well, are the students learning anything? I think undoubtedly they're learning. This is an attribute, this is a feature of the human mind. We learn things, whether we like it or not. The question is, what is it that they're learning? Very often they're learning unintended things, like the ways to please us as teachers, to try to infer what they think we expect, attribute different intentions, and try to match them and create, social networks. So some of this might end up being useful to them. It might even be useful to us, or maybe even consonant with our intentions if we had questioned them. But this is entirely happenstance. The problem is whether how effective are we to have intentional transmission of something. And I think, but I really liked, Ted. You're making, I think maybe you know this as well, you're making a nuanced and uncommon point, at least certainly in the background where I come from, where I've been immersed for the last 15 years. It is almost flipped from the kind of argument that others would make, but I like it very much for that reason, because it's fresh.
Yeah, how to. I'm thinking about too many things at once. So, I just wanted to recommend one book that people might find interesting. It's called The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself. It's actually a book about rhetoric, right? But it makes the point that what people choose to believe, the nature of truth, is often linguistic, right? That someone who is able to completely throw themselves into making statements that are objectively false, but they can seem so authentic in what they're saying that's false, that can be very persuasive to people, right? And in some sense, mathematics can be thought of as a form of rhetoric because it has very rigorous rules about logic. And you can pick apart someone's argument if it's supposedly mathematical. And so when you talked about learning mathematics as a way of learning how to think, I think that's very crucial. And combining that with rhetoric, as other ways that people make arguments, would be very, very helpful. I mean, students should learn the entire spectrum of ways that people use rhetoric, whether it goes from mathematical rhetoric to purely argumentative or political rhetoric. I mean, it's something that people used to study, I guess. They used to study rhetoric more explicitly, but now not as much. I think it's very important when you look at what's happening in the world. Oh, I did want to say one thing about the comment from Matt in the chat. I have a feeling that creative people can turn that, if you encourage creativity, it's sort of omnidirectional. At least hopefully it's omnidirectional. If somebody can be creative, if they think of creativity as a value, they will look for ways to be creative in whatever they're doing. If they think of following the rules as a value and not questioning them, maybe they'll be somewhat less creative. So I think of creativity as almost a value that can be applied to different careers, different directions. Now, I would never try to prevent professors from writing their own books. I would encourage them to write their own books, and that's great. I mean, if people are enthusiastic, they try to write their book, fantastic. But ultimately, you need peer review. I mean, in academia, there has to be peer review. You have to convince your peers that this is the book to use, right? And sometimes that's not the way it works. And frankly, it's just not. That's not the way it works, depending on the political structure that's present. So you don't want to choose someone's book mainly because there's something that doesn't have to do with the intrinsic quality of the book that's leading to that choice. That, I think, is not a good thing. The same way as accepting a paper for a research journal because the guy who wrote the paper is your buddy. We just don't do that. You have to have a rigorous peer review that's independent. I would choose many of my colleagues' books straight off, but I wouldn't choose all of them. There has to be the opportunity to make a choice. The question of conflict of interest about royalties is interesting. I frankly think that should be independent, right? I mean, I think if faculty choose to buy that book, then they should get the royalties. If faculty have a free choice and they choose the book written by a colleague, my position would be that was an independent choice. So the colleague should actually get royalties for those books. But there are serious issues there, and I could understand maybe there's a different point of view. Maybe you could tell me why it was a problem that people in your department didn't write the textbook for lower level classes. Why was that bad?
So I actually asked more than once different faculty about the possibility of writing a calculus book, for example, for the department as a team, because the calculus books that we've used all have stupid things in them, and I want to avoid those. And when I talked about them in the class about how wrong they were, the students would balk, and then I'd get lower teaching evaluations. And the other faculty would just say, well, we're going to do it this way on the exams anyway. So, for example, what's a discontinuity of a function? The books all define it wrong. And that's because they don't know any topology when they write their books. That's my,
right.
I'm being hyperbolic, but it's basically the problem. The notion of a continuity of a function or a discontinuity of a function is a very, very carefully defined concept, but not in a calculus book.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
then the students are being tested over it in ways that the students who understand what a continuity of a function is will get lower grades because they answer the way the book does not teach it.
Matt, may I interject something here, especially because we're talking about calculus, and I find myself teaching calculus a lot as well. I find what you just said, I completely agree and resonate with, but it's a side, in my opinion, it's a small aspect of a larger thing, which is that,
Yes.
in my opinion,
Yes.
a calculus class should be about understanding functions as objects. And in this case, for example, in the standard definition that they use of continuity, they treat them as collections of values rather than objects in of themselves, where, continuity would be a property of that object. So it's a change in perspective. It's written from the wrong perspective.
Very much so. Yeah.
You know?
But also, I don't think that the calculus books do even a very good a very good explanation of what they even try to do in terms of what you said. That is, a function in a sense is a collection of data points. There is a way to think of it that way. That makes it an object from a set theoretic point of view.
Okay, for Ted C's purpose, perhaps we should say that Matt is our resident non-standard analysis expert. So he will often slip between the finitary and infinitary perspectives. I would say that perhaps a collection of points is or rather a function is a generalization, right?
Yeah.
Of a collection of points or something like this, a model of a collection of points, but yes.
But what they really mess up is that they actually teach students in high school algebra, college algebra, intermediate algebra, and calculus, and linear algebra, and many other books that a function is a formula. And a function is not a formula. It isn't. It's an object that you describe sometimes with formulas.
This is
Sometimes
analogous. This is
That's the
analogous,
problem.
Matt, and I wonder how Ted feels about this from to a much more basic problem of conflating numbers with the symbols we use to represent them.
Exactly.
We
Yeah.
can write with symbols essentially an infinitesimal, literally in this case, an infinitesimal proportion of the numbers. But so most numbers don't have names for them, right? Almost all numbers don't have names for them. But the notion of a number is very well defined. I struggled with that in my philosophy of math class this year. In fact, I started as Hampkins does and spent the whole first month essentially talking exactly about that. And you're absolutely right. The question of what is a closed form formula, we say in calculus, right? This is computable. This integral, for example, is computable in closed form. What does that mean? I mean, we say,
That's right.
I'm not saying it isn't an important concept because it's a concept that keeps coming up in the practice of mathematics.
Yeah.
But we need to
But it's
acknowledge that
relative
it's
to the observer. Yeah.
purposefully ambiguous, ill-defined concept that changes meaning in different contexts. And we, as Ted was just saying, we have to say what it's about. We have to not pretend like it's some sort of hidden truth that exists. We have to talk about it as a human endeavor, as part of our sense making. Sorry, Irfan, go ahead.
Also, when you said changes across context, we should also say changes across history. For instance, before power series
yes.
and things like that were discovered, things that had to do with e to the x would not be closed form. But if we teach students that throughout human history, mathematics has been used to try to understand natural sciences, and in this manner, we started being able to have computable approximations to more and more natural phenomena. They can understand that sometimes these formulas appear as approximations to what is happening in the natural world. Of course, they have an abstract existence outside of that too, speaking like a Platonic here. But we don't teach any of that history of how these formulas even came to be. And the students often get a warped sense that mathematics was just always there and they have to somehow understand these formulas, otherwise they don't understand how things work, and then they give up on understanding how things work because the mathematics we present to them feels ununderstandable to them. That's been my feeling when
I
I
don't want
teach.
to co-opt it completely, but I want to respond to Irfan real quick.
Yeah.
To be fair to the calculus books, there are some of them that do have little peeks into history of the concepts in relation to the actors, like Isaac Newton. They'll have a little biography and a little bit of discussion of how he affected things. And I think that helps, but it's way too little in the books. And then it's even worse in the classroom. Because like you said, even though it's there, we don't teach it. Why don't we teach it? Because we're coordinated and everybody has to teach the same thing and you're all on the same schedule. You have to get this many, you have to follow the problem list and actually do a bunch of the problems for the students instead of actually helping them understand material or asking them questions to find out if they understand the material during class time, because you just don't have time to do any of that stuff.
Yeah, which is why I actually started with that question. What's the goal of the universities having these courses if we don't have time for such things? And that's
And I
probably
have
a very long-winded discussion.
and I wrote some things about that in the chat. But Ted, I wanted to ask you something real quick as well about something you said much earlier. You said that the student came to you, this was early in your career, as I understood
Yes,
it,
you're teaching.
and asked you what's going on. Now that question has so many different contexts to it. I'm kind of wondering what the student meant and what you thought they meant and what. So, for example, what's going on could be, or it could be a question that's essentially like, oh, professor, you seem like you're having trouble emotionally. Are you on a brink of a nervous breakdown? Or oh, professor, is the department forcing you to teach this stuff we don't like? Or what's he mean by what's going on? It's too broad a question.
He specifically said he wanted to, as an efficiency engineer, he wanted to suggest how I could teach better. So I don't think it was necessarily a personal question about my mental health. Instead, I think he was trying to tell me that he wanted me to be more committed to telling the class how I actually viewed the subject, how I actually viewed the formalism that I was describing. When I've gone to visit people, when I was undergraduate chair, I would have to go and visit people's teaching, right, and watch how they taught. And there were massive differences. And some faculty, it always seemed to me that they were falling back on formalism, writing equations, falling back on kind of they weren't investing in what they were saying, what they valued and what they didn't value in terms of how the subject was working. I mean, the fact that you told your class that the material in the book was wrong is an example of someone telling the student what you really think is going on. Namely, something's going wrong in this book, and I'm going to make it right for you. That's the kind of commitment that I think my student was asking for, right? Rather than a formal recitation, or even worse, a reference to someone else's video to try to explain to them what that other guy thinks was going. I mean, so that's what they were looking for. They were looking for what you.
The current setup in education with the popularity measure for everything disincentivizes that, because the students will vote with their feet. They will go to the professor who's doing it like everybody else, because then they can use the solved homework problems from anybody in the department that does it the normal way. Okay, does it the way the book talks about it, even when the book is wrong. And they can memorize those solutions and regurgitate them on an exam. And 3 weeks later, they don't know any of it, right? That's the problem you addressed earlier. The student took the final and went from a 75 to a 7.
Yeah.
Well, 75 is an example of cramming, right?
Right.
So I don't want to do. The 7 is the score I want to keep, because it shows that they didn't keep what they learned, actually memorized. That's my view of it, but I don't keep the 7 because it would be a horrible nightmare to do so.
Right.
And you pointed that out too. We didn't keep the 7 because, well, in fairness to the student, in a way, because the system encourages memorization.
Yeah, exactly.
But then that means the feedback we're giving to all our students is memorization is more important than understanding.
I'm going to try to experiment when I teach this same course this fall, and I'm going to talk to the students about the 75 to 7 effect. And I'm going to try to tell them, I'm going to try to tell you what's going on. And I'm really interested in this making more lasting impacts in your future. I'll see if that helps, but
that's a good idea. Now, in the pre-Trump days, I'm sorry to bring up that, but the pre-lack of a Department of Education days, you could write a grant proposal to do that and get people to create surveys for your students to ask them about this phenomenon of 75 to 7 and whether they saw it occurring in their own, and get those surveys done right. And you could write a paper afterwards and disseminate the results. But as it is for now, it seems like when you do this, it's going to be a one-off. You won't have, you might be able to write a introspective paper or subjective paper, or a retrospective paper, depending on how you want to do it. and submit it to the Math Monthly or something like that, or some teaching journal, but getting a more formal,
Yeah.
financially supported experiment, I
Yeah.
think would be more effective.
Yes.
But now in the current administration, you probably wouldn't get the money.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
You're
they
fine.
wouldn't fund the grant, or they'd take it away 3 weeks later. So
You can write to the Simmons Foundation. I mean, you don't have to write to the federal government. I mean,
that's a good
why?
idea. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So
Only private institutions now. Yeah.
I mean, even the government is a private institution if you really think about it. So, but it's a private institution where actually you get money without maximal consent, though. So it's actually that it's kind of corrupt in a sense. So I find it's more proper to actually convince a group of people that what you want, the question you want to answer, is relevant, and then they can give you the money, and then if others are interested, maybe you can license it, you can sell it. I think that's a little bit more honest, because remember, we have a problem of being relevant, right? I mean, Pythagoras analyzed how to do cryptography like 2,500 years ago, but it goes above people's minds, right? So, but how Pythagoras made himself relevant, uh, he found different ways. We shouldn't be thinking that our own, let's say, idiosyncratic and kind of like cocoon type of vision should be immediately understood and appreciated by anybody else. And I think that's the issue we face with education. The way we teach calculus, we teach it in a way so the students will acquire some skills that the real world, quote unquote, real world would say, okay, I like these skills, therefore I'm going to compensate you for implementing them. Unfortunately, we have that conundrum of being relevant, because if you go too far ahead from the pack, you're going to be lost in the wilderness. So that's a little bit of the conundrum. Now, the other thing about I'm even though I really liked it when the professors kind of like gave you an insider's look and say, well, the book says it this way, but it's not exactly correct, and they gave you kind of like a more proper, formal. I really loved it. However, I think it's pedagogically wrong. It's like the same way when you have the parents fighting in front of the children. This has to be done between the quote unquote adults. That has to be done in the departmental meetings. You cannot go out in the students and kind of give them an incentive that the field is kind of like the sausage making is way more dirty than you think it is. Like, you have to keep that idealism in the students. There is a maturity gap between college students, even though they are adults, they can all vote the same way, older adults can, but there is a maturity gap. In other words, what you have seen from your going into the social making of mathematics doesn't mean that you need to expose the students to that. So I would advise against that. But then again, if textbooks have mistakes, solve that in committee when you decide textbook, and then solve it there. And then now, if you can make something teachable out of it, all the best. But going to the students and say, well, the books we are giving you, they have mistakes, then it's going to give them, like, it's going to disillusion them, and possibly it's going to be a motivation killer for the majority of the students. It may spur the outlier who is really into going into the weeds. Yes, that could be constructive for them, but you're going to lose, I think, the big majority, and you're going to give them an excuse to kind of develop these kind of like unwarranted institutional disillusionment, which we are in this. That's I think the most challenging part of our time, is this crisis of institutions and the trust and the integrity of the institutions. And I think the blame for that is from the institutions, not from those that are kind of like skeptical about them.
So you
Just say one
mentioned
thing.
committees, and I think that's important, but let me point out an example of what happens with committees. I was on a committee to select a new differential equations textbook. We all met several times and tried to work out why we selected one textbook over another. When it was all done, the chairman said, "We're not changing our textbook." That was it. So I had colleagues in the department, close colleagues, who were on the committee, who said, "Why did we waste our time on the committee?" And I agree. Why be on the committee if all you're going to do is make a recommendation that the chairman's not going to take? It's a waste of time. And it was based on the fact that the students liked the book we already had more than we wanted it. And we wanted to go back to a book we had used before. They didn't want to do that. And they didn't want to do it just because, well, the chairman thought that students liked it better. The students are going to change. They're going to be a different batch of students the next year. One of the reasons we wanted to choose a new book was it was
Matt,
better.
we have
And
about
better
5
math.
minutes left on the YouTube live stream, so I want to give Ted C an opportunity to also
sure.
respond. Yeah.
Let me just make one comment about what Giannis said, which I think is very interesting. And now I confess that I came of age in the 70s. Okay? So the 70s were all about questioning authority. And I honestly believe that mathematics is about questioning authority. It has to be. It has to be. And teaching the students to question authority is part of our job. Now that may be passé. I mean, maybe that's 50 years out of date. But that's, I think, the true strength of learning math. It's correct because it's right. It's not correct because some book says it's right. It's correct because it's right, and you have to check it, especially now with AI. I mean, I've done many exercises where I'll take, a standard book on linear algebra, I'll ask ChatGPT the answer, ChatGPT is wrong. So people have to question authority, and that's the reason, for me, that's one of the reasons that math is important. So we have to teach them that. And if they get disillusioned with textbooks, well, maybe they better be disillusioned. I had one of my favorite engineering professors. His name was Serdar Gekti, but his nickname was Good Try Zero. He was Good Try Zero because that's what he would write on your paper. If you didn't know what you were talking about, you got a Good Try Zero. And I would tell my students
Good try zero.
Good try zero.
Sorry, say that again. Okay.
It's good try zero. Your score was a 0, but you made a good try.
Oh, I see. I thought you meant good try zero as opposed to now you can do another good try 1, 2, and so on.
No. Good try, comma, grade 0. Right. That's what he did. You don't get partial credit if your space shuttle blows up. I mean, that's just the way it is. So that's something you need to tell people in a math class. Okay, so
I want to just add one more thing because you got to the water almost. I just want to make sure that is said. And I think I strongly suspect you would agree with this, that not only is it essential for math to tell the truth, to speak, to power. It doesn't matter. It's not about who says what, but math is about thinking, not about knowing. It's about thinking. So what we're trying to teach them is how to think, not how to know things. And I think it's important, therefore, to always cultivate different perspectives, other ways of thinking. That it's not about the answer. It's about all the different ways that you had to think to get to the answer and to get to possibly other answers. There's too much implication of uniqueness in the way we teach. that we teach about the answer as opposed to a possible answer. And so I think, yeah, just complimenting what you were talking about, Ted, and just pushing it more if you're willing to go there.
Well, I hate the phrase best practices. I mean, often people in education, they will say, well, these are the best practices. And what's happened when I challenge them and say, really? I mean, is there a unique best here that's implied? They will say, oh, it's just a term of art. And then I'll say, well, that's total bullshit, except I don't actually say that directly, but I imply it. And
so what I would say is my practice is the best practice. And if they say, well, how do you know? I'd say it's a term of art. Just give them back what they give you. I wanted to point out also real quick. Okay.
Actually, we are actually about to close soon. So I wanted to ask Ted, before we go, just generally, what would you say for someone who's watching this later on YouTube, let's say, what should the audience take out of this video?
Well, I hope there will be future research about consequences of different methodologies to retention of learning and to student long-term motivation. And that I hope we'll have more creative ideas in the future about how to encourage students to question authority and to look at the world from a mathematical perspective. I actually believe those things are better than specific skill training, particularly since AI is going to do those skills better than humans in short order. And I guess the last thing I would say is the 3 points I advanced about how to deal with math education in departments where people have disagreements, create a safe space for disagreements, be careful about mandating texts without peer review, and support the civil service. We need an independent civil service. If you see the civil service being eliminated by people who are not independent, that's a sign that something's going off the rails. And that's pretty much all I will say.
Yeah, thanks for this great discussion. I think we'll stop the live streaming now, but we'll continue the discussion on Zoom, hopefully.